I would like to start with a very typical question that is, what got you into programming?
Huh. Um, I guess programming for me, um, I knew at a very early age. I was probably the only one in my elementary school who knew what they wanted to do when they grew up. Um, I was exposed to computers pretty young, maybe 8 years old or so, and just kind of became very technically adept with them. Just as far as using Windows and understanding diagnostics and getting into DOS and things like that. I guess I've always been a bit of an engineer type mind. Playing with Legos at an early age, but just kind of liking to figure things out and make things go. So programming was a good outlet for that.
All right. What about the first language you've touched? And when was that? At like what age?
Um, in middle school, I want to say, so maybe 13 years old, 12 years old. I learned HTML4 over a summer.
Okay.
Um, and from there, I learned JavaScript. DHTML was a huge thing at the time. So those were kind of my first forays into programming. There's also a really great um, program called Click and Play that was essentially like a PowerPoint that you could script and make games in. So I would make little racing games and things like that for myself at the time too.
And what was the first functioning program that you've written?
Um, for that same middle school, I was given a chance to teach my entire computer class HTML. So me and the computer class wrote the school's first digital yearbook, distributed on CDs because not everyone had internet at the time.
Okay, that's quite big and more impressive than what most people say about their first programs, and more the start. That's really impressive. Um, Back to the origins. So your interest came from within yourself, or was it like your upbringing or the environment? What gave you that inspiration so early on that you knew what you want?
That's a good question. I did grow up with an uncle who was slightly more technically minded. He didn't know how to program or anything, but he was also kind of into computers. When I was very young, I went to go visit him for a holiday of some sort, and he set up a little uh, multiplayer Doom session. So me and my cousin played Doom and Doom 2, and I really think that's probably the first moment where I was like, oh, I want to make things like this because this is the coolest thing I've ever done.
Nice. And uh, how is so the first inspiration was your uncle, and now that you are where you are, do you have any other inspirational person that you look up to?
Um, People I look up to, well, for kind of going off of that, probably rooted in that session of playing Doom, I've always looked up to John Carmack. If you've ever heard him
Yes.
talk, the way he goes in super in depth and just geeks out over um, whatever he's working on, you can tell he's kind of super excited and really loves to collaborate with people on things. And I think I've kind of maybe based my own based my own style of programming a lot on that. I've always been just very enthusiastic about learning some new thing. What makes it tick, and kind of chatting with people about just weird little things in programming that maybe a lot of others don't care about.
Right. Um, that's cool. Carmack is for those who don't know, is basically the originator of 3D games, and he did a lot in computer graphics in regards to gaming. Um, so um, now let's move on slightly more to what you do now and so you did mention that you are working on your personal projects and you're also a full-time programmer, and as programmers we really need to code sometimes for a really long time. And how do you prepare yourself for those long coding sessions? Is there anything special that you do?
Um, no, there's really no special preparation. I would, you know, flow state is a real thing, and if you
Yeah.
can find a way to isolate yourself, like I'm big into headphones, so I'm always wearing headphones in the office, playing something, just to kind of maybe isolate myself a little bit more. Um, but yeah, I guess that's really all I do.
So headphones that plays music, I presume, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, okay. Regarding music, is it anything in particular, or it's literally based on the mood, and as long as it cancels out outside noise and creates you and some environment is good enough?
Yeah. There's no real specific programming music. I mean, I listen to, well, maybe there is things that are a little, um, maybe a little less vocals.
Yeah.
So you can just kind of concentrate, and the music, if it's a little like rhythmic, it can kind of keep you going, keep you at a fast pace. So I listen to a lot of like movie scores, taiko drumming, electronic music, that sort of thing when I'm coding.
Right. I'm very similar. Also, I to me lyrics are distracting, and as long as it's just some background music, that's literally just music and not a song. I like that a lot. Um, Regarding the flow, and actually regarding the flow and distractions, um, how do you manage that? Because especially as a senior developer, your role is usually not just coding by yourself but also helping out your more junior colleagues, and in general there are people who are contacting you throughout the day, and that does not definitely help the flow. How do you handle this? How do you continue the flow, manage those mini interruptions?
Um, some days you can't. I think you make it better at it over time. At first, it annoys you, and then you kind of realize that it's unavoidable. Yeah, I like helping others figure things out. At Microsoft, it's maybe a little different from other places. Most of the developers, at least on my team, are fairly independent. So we do you do get requests for help every now and then, but largely largely people just kind of function on their own. Most of the requests would come in from outside of the team, actually. Asking how to use HTTP client, for instance, things like that. And those are all handled over email generally, so they don't really break your flow state that bad.
Okay. What do you think? How much time do you personally need to get into it? Like how much of coding would you need without interruption to get that focus going?
I guess it depends on the day, but maybe about 30 minutes or so.
Ooh,
Um,
that's
yeah.
good. It's really good. I think for me it's definitely longer. And actually, for me, it doesn't happen all the time. There's just days when I just cannot get
Oh yeah.
into the focus.
Everybody has those days.
Yes.
There are a lot of different responsibilities on the .NET team, so you can easily spend an entire day doing barely any coding yourself.
Yeah.
Doing things like code reviews, GitHub moderation, and issue triage, that sort of thing. So there have definitely been a few days where I've done barely any code, but I've still been fully functioning. So that's kind of I guess, a nice thing that you can take advantage of your strong days and your weekdays.
Right. Um, so there are still those days when you're not really in the mood, or maybe those days when you are more tired. So the question would be, what is there anything in particular that drains you the most throughout your day when you're programming?
Is there anything in particular that does what?
Drains your energy, frustrates you, annoy
Oh,
you, yeah, tires you.
um, probably the same things that most developers feel. Nothing's worse than a meeting that you can tell could have been handled over a quick IM session or email or something like that.
Yeah,
We don't have too many of those, but I think everyone experiences them at some point, and I've
yeah.
never met anyone who enjoys them.
Yeah, same. I hate meetings for the sake of meeting. The time was set up, or throughout the year you have those spots for meetings, and you don't really need to be there every single time. It's just there because that's how the company policy is. That's how we decided to do our work. I really hate those. Yeah. Um.
Well, what you find, I think, is a lot of people are not good at communicating over just email. They really like a face to face. It can be very useful to draw out ideas. Just grab a piece of paper or a whiteboard if there's one in the room, that sort of thing. So
Yes.
in-person meetings are definitely very useful, and even when they seem, even when they challenge you, the others in the room might be very appreciative of them. So it's kind of, I guess, something you can learn to be helpful with.
Yeah. Um, my personal opinion is that meetings are better when they are more ad hoc, on demand, and not formalized and set out throughout the week or months in advance. I like when things have a meaning and a very specific one, and not just a formality. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so you have a day full of meetings. You come back home, and what do you do to recharge yourself?
Um, Sometimes I will work on a personal project. Other times I will just, play some video games or read a book. Just chill with my cats.
Right. What's your favorite book?
My favorite book, um, probably Dune from Frank Herbert.
Oh,
If
okay.
it's kind of a sci-fi masterpiece, I would recommend it to anyone. If you're talking more businessy programming skills book, there's one that I love called Multipliers. That really, it was a huge eye opener to me. Before I had read it, I think I had a focus on kind of being. I wanted to be the rock star wherever I was,
Mhm.
and the book kind of teaches you that you can be far more impactful if you help others kind of be their best than if you focus just on yourself. And it's told through a lot of examples from tech companies and things like that. Even though it's not targeted specifically at developers, it's something that I think every developer should read. I took a lot out of it.
So could you repeat the name and the author?
The book name is Multipliers. I can't recall the author.
Okay, I'll try to Google up and link it. Or okay, the Wise Man Group.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Doodle. Okay, nice. I haven't heard about the book myself, so it's an interesting find. Thanks for that. Um, so now let's move on to how your career started. What was the first programming job that you did? Where did it start from?
The first job I ever did was I met this guy who wanted to make essentially like a hotels.com. He wanted to be able to book hotels, travel, things like that. He was very untrustworthy of scripting languages because he felt that any internet host could go on and steal all your code and put up your business elsewhere. So he wanted it written in C. So I wrote this huge website in C as a CGI program. Um, yeah, that was the first one.
Oh wow. And how did it work? Is it still running?
I have no idea if it's still running. I would hope not.
Yeah. Wow. Um, so at that time you were working alone?
It was me and one other person. They were more in charge of like the HTML basic design stuff, and I was more in charge of all the business logicy stuff.
Right. At the time, how did you guys let's say version your code and mm, I bet like everything was manual. There was no testing. I just assume at that time.
Yeah, there was no testing. Things like Agile weren't a thing yet.
Yeah,
So we largely communicated over email and the occasional phone call. We did use CVS to manage our
yeah.
code. Um, so that worked out fairly well. Yeah, with especially with just one other person.
Okay. Uh, that's pretty good. All right. And um, so you were mostly interested. Well, you started from C, C++, and what pushed you to C sharp? And what do you like about it?
So I think I learned C sharp mainly just to learn another language. I was very heavy in these native languages, and it was kind of a choice between um, Java, PHP, and C sharp. And I actually got a very thick Java book um, one night, and I read about a chapter or two of it, and just for some reason it didn't click with me. So I ended up learning PHP and C sharp. Um, I think C sharp I really enjoyed for its simplicity. At the same time, coming from C++ and being someone who really likes optimizing code, C sharp can be, or it could be at the time, tremendously irritating when you see stray instructions for bounce checking and things like that. But overall, I kind of liked it. It allows you to much more quickly write your app as opposed to finding out how to build things and putting together 20 completely disparately designed libraries like you typically see in C++ code.
Yeah, yeah. Well, most of us love C sharp, and for similar reasons. I like the sugar. I love the sugar. I sometimes get too drugged of it, and it's not always a good thing, but it offers that flexibility at the same time as the power and
Yeah, I think in more
performance.
recent years, especially, C sharp has become much more experimental. Maybe not. Maybe experimental is not the right word, but they've taken so much inspiration from functional languages, for
Yeah.
instance, and they've kind of they kind of take bits and pieces that have been successful in other languages and somehow merge them all into one language that most of it all feels very idiomatic, even though, for instance, Link is very functional, but it fits right at home in C sharp.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I like that mix. It makes the language not being too focused on just one paradigm, but it just uses whatever makes development easier and whatever development process needs. Um,
Yeah, it kind of lets you use whatever is best for the job, but still staying in one language, and that's pretty powerful.
yeah. So fast forward to where you are now, which is Microsoft at one of. So you said that you own System.net namespace. Do you co-own it with anyone else, or is that literally the whole everything that falls under that namespace is uh, what is your responsibility?
So on the .NET team, you can essentially work on any space, but everyone has a space that they're kind of responsible for. And we have on the System.net team 5, 6 people who all work on different areas of it. Um, we all work on all of it, but primarily my focus has been HTTP client, at least as of late.
Okay, school. There's one really good question, so I'll ask it. There is Project Walker asked. There is a sentiment that C# is growing too much with so many new features, and it will start to feel cluttered. Do you agree with this statement?
Maybe, um, C++ um, kind of shows what can happen when you add just a ton of stuff to one language. I love C++, and it's incredibly powerful, but it's also very difficult to learn because it has so much. Every time you think that you've mastered it, you learn that there's some new area that you haven't been into. Um, C sharp, we generally try very hard to only add high impact features that we know people will actually use. So I hope that it won't go that route. There are certainly some areas that maybe we could do a little better in, but I think by and large it's not that cluttered right now. We're still doing good.
Okay. Um, so you do not agree with that statement. It's not. You don't think it will be cluttered. Like so far it moves the right direction basically.
Yeah, I think it's the right direction. A lot of productivity features, things like async await, for instance, having done all sorts of networking and concurrency programming prior to async await, when that feature was first introduced, my eyes lit up as kind of like, oh, this is exactly what I want. So you find a lot of C sharp features like that where it's very targeted, and some things might be a little unnatural to read at first, but as you use them, you find that it's still pretty good.
Right. Um, really want to ask this question. It's also on topic. So Alpha 7 asked, as a C++ developer, do you think Go will be more dominant in the future?
Maybe I think programming languages right now are a bit hypey, and Go is still kind of in a bit of a hype phase, but they've been around long enough that you actually do have a lot of serious coding being done in it as well. I think it's here to stay. I don't know if it'll be more dominant. I think um, languages like Rust are probably going to catch on a little bit. There's you kind of have to think about where languages fit. You have things like C and C++ that are much more advanced, much more performance driven, and you have things like C sharp that are much more productivity driven.
Yeah.
And there's only a little bit of space in between those two ends to really innovate in a language that people want to use. So I can see Go and Rust existing for a while. I don't know if they'll ever be the dominant languages.
Okay, and what's your opinion on management of concurrency and Go? Because that's basically the key feature.
I don't have a huge amount of experience in Go. I've played around with it a little bit, so I'm by no means an expert. Um, I do like the sort of concurrency, asynchronicity first design of it. I think probably Go and Node.js were the first successful languages to really target that, and it's definitely a huge strength of those.
Okay, yeah, I'm on a similar with a similar opinion. Let's go back to the Microsoft topic. So, why Microsoft? Why did you choose that place?
um, so if you had told me 15, 20 years ago that I'd be working for Microsoft, I would have laughed at you. um, I've always been very into open source and things like that. So I never really thought I'd be working for Microsoft, but then .NET Core was open sourced, and I found that Microsoft had tried to do some open source things prior to .NET Core, and in my eyes, largely failed. There were certain things like, here's the code, but you can't actually contribute. We're just putting the code online. Things like that. That you could tell were done by people who had heard the word open source but didn't quite understand it. And .NET Core really got it. I was so excited when it was first open sourced that I had these features and bug fixes and things that I had filed for framework and never got in. So I was like, oh, this now's my chance. I can do these things that I wanted to. So I came in with a PR lightning fast to add async uh, versions for all of the Xlink, like the X document classes.
Hmm.
I came in so quick that the response from the .NET team was essentially, we haven't really figured out how to accept code from outsiders yet on this scale and new APIs like this. So just we'll figure it out together. um, so I was very excited about that, and I think because I've always really liked things like low level code, optimization, that sort of thing. Working on .NET was
Yeah.
really a perfect fit for me. So yeah, I was really excited to join the .NET team.
Oh, okay. And how does it compare working in .NET to other places? Sorry, Microsoft to other places.
I've not. Microsoft is the first large tech company that I'd been at. I had pretty much tried to avoid them up until that point, choosing to work for smaller companies, local companies, that sort of thing. Um, in some ways, the culture is very different. The biggest uh, thing for me was less about code and process and things like that, and more just about um, being around so many other people. Like just the building you're in has so many people, and but then there are 20 different other buildings right around you, to the point where it's almost like a miniature Microsoft city, and everyone's talking code, and there's just so many people that you can't possibly know them all. Um, the the development practices were a bit different. A lot of companies you join and you're given a very specific task. Um, the .NET team is a little different. You basically join and they say, okay, go find something to work on. Um,
Wow.
and we have GitHub issues galore for people to contribute to, but it's fairly undirected unless you're working on one of the more strategic goals.
So they basically have immense trust on the people working on it. Like they don't really force you to do something new. They're just saying go and innovate, basically, right?
Yeah, part of that is through the interview process. I think that they really try to find people who are self starters.
Hmm.
So they generally, the culture is one of just going and finding something to do. And really, when you join, they just kind of put your feet in the fire and say, "Here, have at it."
Okay, I see. Um, what was the process of getting into it? Like how many interviews did you have to pass to finally get through? Was there a coding interview, and what kind of challenges, if I may ask, did you go through?
The first interview I did was actually over Twitter. uh, that was kind of bizarre. And after that, they liked me, so they flew me out for kind of the more traditional interview. Um, yeah, we tend to go through the interviews are called loops here, but we go through 4 or 5 people. It's different for every team. So my experience might be very different from someone on the office team, for instance, but um, went through 4 or 5 people. It is very whiteboard heavy. I remember there's a quote from a long time ago from Microsoft saying code is king, and that is largely still the case. You get some whiteboard problems. Some of them are very leak code-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of problems that force you to be a little abstract. Maybe there's something that you might not ever do in actual code,
Yes.
but they just kind of want to see how you stretch a little bit. Other problems are much more practical, things like API design, for instance. Yeah, I'd say about 80% of the interview is code and 20% is talking, just kind of about your career and little tidbits, things like that.
Oh, okay. So 80% you actually did have to do some kind of problem solving or talking about this software design.
Yeah, it's 80% is on the whiteboard. Um,
Right.
I know Microsoft became kind of famous for weird puzzle questions. I at least didn't have any of those, um, but they certainly do give you whiteboard problems. So if you're on Leak Code solving challenges, things like that, it's you'll be right at home on the whiteboard there.
Yeah. Gotcha. Um, how long does one interview session normally take?
I believe I was there for about 4 or 5 hours.
Hmm.
You tend to get about an hour with each person.
Wow, that's quite a lot.
Yeah, it can. When I got to, I believe the fifth person, their first question was, "All right, are you tired yet?" I guess a lot of people kind of run out of steam when they're going through these interviews. They can be pretty intense.
Yeah, 5 hours is quite crazy, and yeah, okay. Um, now you don't really do you ever get assigned tasks yourself, or are you really the master of your own work? Like you just make your own tasks and make your own estimates, and basically you're rarely in a position that you wouldn't understand how to implement the task that you need to do?
Um, you do get assigned tasks, but only I would say maybe over half of what you do is just kind of generally go improve things. Um, there are strategic initiatives that the PMs on our team do customer research, that sort of thing, to find out kind of what gap they'd like to fill in this release. So there are more strategic initiatives that you do get tasked with. Um, but I'd say by and large you are pretty independent. You can always meet with people if you're working on a much larger feature. If we have bigger APIs that are kind of complex, like system text JSON, for instance, um, typically there will be a little subcommittee within the team of people working on it together.
Okay, so I'm still not very sure if I understood correctly. You do consider yourself working in an agile way, and that there are daily stand-up meetings, retrospects, and so on, or
Oh no,
no?
there's no agile. We do have team meetings. They are generally more intended just to keep people informed of what you're working on, unblock you if you need opinions, that sort of thing. But there's really no process other than just go complete
Oh,
issues from GitHub.
so instead of being Scrum, it's more like Kanban. You just create items, drag them around the board. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we generally don't even use boards. um, if you look on GitHub right now, we have projects. Like there's one for HTTP2 and those sort of things. We really use those to as really more of like a dashboard to see what work is left than resource scheduling or anything like that.
So basically, your work is public, open source, then everyone can see it.
Definitely. And it's actually really strongly emphasized on the team that the overwhelming majority of what we do should all be in public. So operate out of GitHub as much as possible. We do have private meetings, but yeah, by and large, it's all public.
Wow, that's really cool. Do so does anyone so everyone basically does the same thing? Like if whatever is .NET Core related, as long as it's open source, it's going to be managed through a GitHub projects board and not through uh, Microsoft version control like DFS or similar.
Well, .NET Core, yes, but we are the .NET team, not just the .NET Core team. So
Hmm.
we're also in charge of framework, even though that is largely not being updated anymore. We still have things like if someone finds a bug in it, um, that sort of thing. So we still do need to work on that, and those are through more internal things with TFS and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Um, Now moving on to your personal projects. Um, could you tell what you're working on at the moment?
Uh, sure. So at the moment, I have kind of a pet project. Um, I like to drive. So I started getting into um, tuning cars, and I noticed that a lot of what people do when they tune cars is they will take a bunch of measurements from a car, plug them into a spreadsheet, and get some numbers out the other end, and they'll do this over and over again until their car runs faster, for instance.
Yeah,
And I kind of started getting into that, and I was like, oh, I can make a program that does this better and faster. So that's kind of what I spend a lot of my free time on. I also work on a lot with 3D printing. So I've been kind of learning to 3D model and building my own 3D printers, that sort of thing lately.
Awesome. What program do you use for modeling?
Fusion 360
Okay,
from Autodesk.
right. Uh, the other program you mentioned, the one that tunes cars, is it open source? Is it on GitHub?
Right now, it's not. There is kind of a very initial version of it that essentially just did what the spreadsheets do on GitHub right now. But right now, kind of the more advanced code I haven't put out. It's kind of dangerous because enthusiasts for cars are willing to try dangerous things. So
Oh,
I
yeah.
kind of chose to not put out some experimental features.
Yeah. What could go wrong? What's the worst thing that could go wrong?
Well, your engine could blow up. So yeah.
Oopsie. Right. Uh, so you are a person who is constantly learning and is basically by your nature basically you're learning things. You're a learner and you're innovator. So how what do you consider an efficient way of learning? What's your way of learning?
Hmm. Um. I think I'm someone who, whenever I find something new that's interesting, I tend to obsess about it until I've kind of mastered it. So learning to me is typically I'll find documentation, or if it's really complicated, a book, to kind of get myself a little base understanding of something, and then I'll just go at it. You know, try things out. You have to kind of be of the mindset that your product is not going to be perfect. Like your code is not going to be good in a new language until you've used it for a while. So you have to accept the imperfections and just hope that a year from then you'll look back at that and be like, oh, that was incredibly ugly. I made progress.
Okay. Um, to be more precise, do you think that it's better to learn from books, videos, official documentation? What's your best way, or through human discussion?
I think that maybe my perspective will be a little different because like YouTube and Twitch and everything didn't exist when I was first learning. So for me, it was very heavy on books, always chatting on IRC with other programmers. Um, so that's kind of how I started. Now I'm very comfortable just tending to read documentations and little snippets online to learn. But I think that videos can be very powerful. Um, I don't know if they're as good as a book necessarily in all cases. Books tend to be, you know, very well thought out and edited, and
Mm,
videos tend to be a little more on the fly.
yeah.
So maybe you'll go a little more in depth in books. But that said, there are a lot of great videos, like everything from what you do, kind of teaching the fundamentals of programming, to like if you go on Channel 9, you can find these really amazing deep dives where like Windows kernel developers will tell you how they designed some feature within the kernel. So you can get a very broad understanding of things if you even if you just stick with videos.
Yeah, that's true. So the best way, according to you, would be a mix of resources, nothing specific.
Yeah, I guess you just have to learn how what works best for you. Some people
Yeah,
are very good with books. Other people, videos are much more powerful for them.
yeah, that's true. Um, Now let's move to the part many people have been waiting for. What do you think was the biggest fuck up in your career?
Um, there've certainly been there've been a couple moments. Um, there was a time when I was working with a customer for a very long time, very successful with them, and one day I got an email saying, "Hey, you just um, you just gave out $20,000 worth of goods that we didn't authorize you to give out." I think that was my first moment where I really started sweating, being like, "Oh God, did I do something?" I eventually found out that it was not my fault, but you learn for at least for me those 2 or 3 hours when I was trying to investigate what happened. Um, Definitely a very stressful period. There have been other things like we my previous job before this one we was primarily around um, like warehousing, fulfillment of goods. Like if you go on Amazon and order something, if it doesn't ship from Amazon, it would have shipped from us. Uh, One particularly terrible thing that happened was we were putting in addresses from one place into one place on a file into a database, and I ended up swapping the city and address field, I believe.
Okay.
And it caused, for about a week, we had packages for one customer kind of going to completely incorrect locations. Um, uh, that one was solidly my fault, and it's instances where you kind of learn that even if your code's great, you can still make really stupid mistakes.
Yeah. So was it covered with tests, that piece of code?
Not that piece of code, no. You testing can you can be extremely thorough about it.
Yeah.
You can also work in an environment where you have to be, um, very fast to complete projects, that sort of thing. And testing, if you don't have a tester on a project, then sometimes it falls by the wayside. So you kind of learn in those moments what what specific things you need to test so that they don't happen again in the future.
Yeah. And what did you learn anything from that experience? What would you? I don't know. It just happens. I understand that, but would you do anything different, or like, are you more careful with things like that? Does it change anything? Such mistakes in your work?
I think really it changes whatever industry you're in. You will always learn over time kind of the common mistakes that happen. Um, Sometimes you get bad data from outside, and um, if you were to execute on your plan perfectly, that bad data would blow up everything. So some of it is just kind of learning your industry. Others is just, um, I guess, learning to be more diligent, especially with testing. It's if you can't test everything, you at least need to know what to test and when to test.
Yeah.
So I guess that was one of the lessons that I took out of that instance.
Yeah. Gotcha. Uh, Going back to the piece of .NET Core that you maintain, system.net, and everything that falls under it. Do you have any bit of it that you would regard really dirty, and you really don't like to touch it because it has been really, really abandoned or dirty, or you don't understand, and it's like full of comments, do not touch this line or something like that?
There's nothing incredibly dirty. Um, we do have areas where, um, it in the ideal world, your code is very well layered and abstracted and
Yeah.
everything like that. But in .NET, there's this consideration that be you have to be incredibly high performance
Yeah.
because you're kind of the baseline for people. You can let application developers write their own slow code, but your code should be fast so that they can succeed when they need theirs to be fast too.
Yeah.
So um, it's code that you might consider dirty in some places, like HTTP client, for instance. There is layering within it, but it's very loose, and it's typically because we need to optimize something, and maybe perfect layering would have been slower.
Right. I don't remember by heart, but is HTTP client with virtual methods? Does it support abstraction, or you need to do something else in terms of that to mock it
Uh,
away? Let's say.
it does support abstraction, but the model is a little different than what people might be used to. We have a HTTP message handler class.
Mm-hmm.
That one is virtual, and people can implement that to mock. But then you take that and you plug it into HTTP client, which itself has no virtual methods.
Right.
So people trying to mock it for the first time, usually you're looking for an interface or a base
Yeah.
class, and it
Yeah.
can be a little confusing if you're not familiar with how it's designed.
Um. So it, if it goes too technical, you can skip to answer this. But I'm just curious. What was the justification behind it? Why is some outside component supposed to be virtual and not the uh, container class, such as HTTP client itself? What would be wrong if it was virtual or if it had an interface?
Uh, I think I was not present for the design of HTTP client, so I can only guess. But my feeling is that I'm sorry, my cats are going crazy right
It's
now. Hold
it's
on.
okay.
All right. Um, I think the goal is that there is not a huge amount of like virtual or abstract stuff within the .NET base class libraries,
Hmm.
and to kind of keep it its usage idiomatic with the rest of it, the choice was that people will always use HTTP client. We don't want them, overloading stuff, because that's largely what you don't do in the rest of the BCL. So um, the design allows you to plug in custom implementations while at the same time having kind of a set of standard features and a very standard familiar API on top of it that doesn't change. That's more within our control.
Right. So basically, if people want to have the stability, you allow that, but at the same time, you don't make it easy to fuck something that works. Basically, like someone who just starts out with it would not be able to override stuff that he should not that
Uh,
easily. I
Maybe,
guess.
yeah. I guess it's more just about making sure that someone who finds it for the first time can know how to use it right away because
Yeah.
it's familiar with how everything else is designed.
Um, okay. Since you are in the owner of that namespace, I'll ask a few questions that are not directly related to it, but about the competitors, about um, uh, do you know Refit client?
I've not seen Refit, but I believe Rest Ease is based on that, and I've seen that.
Basically, a strongly typed HTTP client, where you can have an actual interface and in that interface through attributes encapsulate the um, endpoint that it points to, or the method, much like a controller attribute. So, but basically, you're dealing with an interface and not with a um, um, a client that has no typization, basically. So
Okay, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I think Rusty uses a similar design, so I think I understand. Um, yeah, I mean, HTTP is pretty simple to me, so I've never felt the need to use one of those things that tries to kind of abstract it away.
Yeah.
In fact, I think usually I've done my own abstraction. So what I would do if I'm talking to an API is write a very idiomatic, this is a .NET API for the thing, and then implement all the HTTP logic within that. I think, especially with really well designed APIs that go full in on the REST design goals,
Mm-hmm.
abstracting the HTTP away may not be the best thing. You might end up losing some things like error handling. And I know that a lot of these libraries kind of have escape hatches for when you want to do more than just get an object back as a result.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, what I found is the code tends to not be that clearer than just using HTTP client directly. So that's always what I've ended up doing.
Right. We do use refit at work, and it doesn't, to me at least, work very well because it's a bit silly because you end up still using HTTP message handlers that you have to inject into the service provider of that thing, which beats the purpose really of simplifying things because it just complicates them instead of simplifying. And on top of that, you actually have to have the interface. And if you're communicating with an outside service, if that service changes, well, you need to adapt to those changes, unlike HTTP client, which in itself is some sort of an abstraction, you could say, for calling a service. So you're losing that abstraction, or rather having an abstraction that you depend on when using Refit. So yeah, I also don't really like it. I used to like it, but I don't really like it anymore.
Yeah, I guess just you just have to be comfortable with it. I think a lot of problems with working with APIs can be solved very quickly by running things like Fiddler, and just kind of seeing what the actual request that went out on the
Yeah,
wire was. So if you're doing that, then you should already be reasonably familiar with HTTP, and using the client directly is probably not a big leap for you.
yeah, that's right. Okay, um, let's move on to your highlights. So, do you have some of your discovery moments or like aha, eureka moments when you basically made your personal breakthrough in terms of massive realization or discovery that you made for yourself? For example, realizing how what actually solid is all about, or let's say how HTTP works, or something else, basically something that changed the way you think or completed the full picture.
Sure. So 15 years ago, I want to say, I had this project called Peer Guardian, and that one was kind of the first one that I had worked on where I was the primary developer, and it ended up getting pretty popular. So I really got to understand all of the aspects of running a project, from sort of not just development, but also working with a large user base, understanding open source and how people are going to use your code and want to contribute, and just kind of ask questions, that sort of thing. Um, I think that was a big moment because it not only taught me how to run a large project, but it also kind of humbled me.
Yeah,
um, I think when you take feedback in from such a large user base, people you learn that people find it easier to criticize than to praise. So you tend to grow a bit of a
Yeah,
thick skin to that sort of thing and learn how to um, take language that may be hastily written and transform that into something that you can actually take action on and try to make other people's lives a little bit easier. It really taught me like a user focused design, like to not mind if some code is complicated for me, if
mm,
it means that the user finds things a little easier themselves.
yeah, yeah. I'm still yet to learn this lesson because I haven't had dealt with massive user base of something that people use that I made. So I'm looking forward for this revelation myself.
Yeah, I mean, even if you just contribute to open source projects, you can kind of get a little part of that.
Mm,
Especially if they're doing, open source tends to be a lot of, people contributing in their own time. It's a passion project for people.
yeah.
Um, so when you're doing code review, you learn like, oh, this code that I think is perfect, they actually don't like something about it, and you kind of have to learn just working with a team, that sometimes being able to adapt to someone else's process is really important, even if you don't get to define it yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Um, so you mentioned this happened 15 years ago. Has anything like that? Is anything like that still happening? They still have those aha moments, even to this day.
Um, it definitely happens less and less. Um, there are so I guess the next one that is really important to me was moving out of a peer developer role and into one with some management responsibilities. Um, I did it more of an experiment, more as an experiment for myself. I kind of was of the mindset that I just wanted to put my head down and code and didn't want to deal with people, but I had an opportunity where I could try, and just see what happens. So I did that, and it's it can be very rewarding, when you work with like a junior developer, for instance, who comes onto your team, very fresh-eyed, good ideas, that sort of thing, and when you help them grow in some way, I think there were moments where a few years after knowing someone, I kind of let them make some important decisions or run a meeting or something like that, and
Mm,
when they do really well, you're like, oh my god, I kind of helped shape them to do that.
yes.
Like I see the improvement in them, and that is like a very special moment.
Yes, yes, that's a very good point. I as well made the C sharp bootcamp for exact one of the reasons was that I like seeing people grow, and that makes me feel really good. So I really dig you in terms of that, and that's a really good point. That when we get experience and when we reach our expertise, we enjoy helping others, sharing our expertise, and get the joy back by sharing and not getting it ourselves necessarily.
Yeah, I think that, especially with helping others online, for instance, it can be pretty rewarding, not just from helping others grow, but also to improve your knowledge of something.
Yeah.
When I was younger and hanging out in IRC, one of the places I hung out, we would write little programming tutorials or little hacking challenges or something like that, and you kind of learn that you don't fully know something until you try to teach it to someone else,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then you learn all the gaps that you have.
Yeah. That's 100% correct. I think Einstein said something like, if you cannot teach any topic to a 5 year old, that means you don't really understand that topic very well.
Yeah, it's very true.
Yeah. um, so, what would you consider your personal achievements in programming career? Like the biggest highlights that you're very proud of?
Hmm. Let's see. Well, I guess the first time I ever got to architect a system from scratch um, is pretty cool. You kind of it's a skill you really have to learn to be able to plan out something that'll work 10
Yeah.
years 20 years down the line,
Yeah.
and it can be really validating when you complete a big project and you see an entire company running on it as its heart. To kind of like go out and see people using it is pretty incredible.
Damn right. So basically, every project that you completed is something that you are proud of.
I think that's pretty reasonable. I mean, uh, a lot of my projects are kind of things where I'm scratching an itch, like maybe an existing solution doesn't work quite the way that I would want it to, or I just think I can bring something new to the experience. So certainly, I have a lot of bigger projects that get a lot of use, and I see things externally. But I also have a lot of smaller projects that, by and large, no one else uses, and it's just for my own experimentation and just having fun. And even in those, I find a lot of good value.
Yeah, awesome. Uh, so back to system.net. What's the current thing that you're working on or trying to do, or like the biggest thing that impacted that piece of .NET Core? What was your most impactful recent change that you did there?
So you may have heard an announcement about a reverse proxy called YARP. I've been largely working with the ASP team to make sure we have all the things that a reverse proxy could possibly need. Um, I wrote the base HTTP 3 implementation that will be shipping in .NET 5. That's probably my largest contribution to date.
Awesome. So HTTP 3, how does that change? What's the difference basically, performance
So
wise or similar
so
feature?
HTTP
Oh,
2 was built over TCP, and the idea that you could run several HTTP requests over one connection. Um, HTTP 3 kind of iterates on that design a bit by splitting the protocol into QUIC and HTTP. So QUIC is just kind of a general TCP ish um, multiple streams over one connection protocol. And it solves some of the problems in HTTP2. For instance, if you have 100 requests going and you lose one packet, it can cause TCP to just halt while it resends the old packet. So all 100 of your requests could be delayed. HTTP 3 runs over UDP, and it kind of has baked in this idea of recovery, and recovery of only the thing that was affected rather than all 100 things that you had going on at once. So it's really going to improve Um, Stability in less than ideal environments. It's also going to improve latency by having much smaller TLS handshakes, for instance, if you're on HTTPS.
Sounds awesome. Sounds really good. So we expect that in .NET 5.
Yeah, it's going to be shipping in preview form. The HTTP3 spec is it's kind of in the final days of standardization. So unfortunately, it didn't standardize quick enough for us to ship like a um, fully vetted
Yeah,
implementation. But we will have a preview.
awesome. Um, Now, regarding your life as a developer, as a programmer, but outside work, how has it impact? How has your career and your way of thinking, being engineer, uh, a finder, looker, searcher, inventor, how has that impacted your personal life? Like, how do you make choices that you make? Um, how to approach problems in general?
Yeah, I think it's very liberating to know that i- if you find a problem in your life that you can write some code to make a little simpler, it can be very liberating to be able to do that. Not a lot of people have that option. They kind of depend on
Yeah,
what others provide to them. Um, but I think also the sort of the mindset of really being able to attack a problem, like your basic debugging skills can apply so much in real life to being able to solve other problems as well. Just um, to help you with critical thinking, that sort of thing. So I guess that's where it spills over into real life.
right. What about looking at the media or random news that you see? Does being a developer, engineer form, or rather allow you to form critical thinking or change your point of view when you look at basically random information or just information in
Yeah,
general?
I mean, I think as a developer, you learn to be kind of skeptical
Yeah,
of code when you're reviewing it.
yeah,
You kind of learn to see pitfalls and where people maybe weren't thinking about the problem all the way, and you can definitely apply that knowledge to whatever media you're consuming. Um, you know, that said, I've worked with a lot of developers who, um, you know, consume some of the media that I would be uh, skeptical of and buy it fully. So I don't think being a developer necessarily makes you a better critical thinker, but it does give you the tools if you're willing to put them to work.
yeah, definitely yes. Uh, okay, now moving on to the end, what advice would you give who is just getting into programming? Someone who is just getting into programming.
Um, I would say become be happy to fail. Every mistake you make, try to learn something from it. You will make a lot of mistakes. Um, Try to be enthusiastic. Laugh when you do something stupid.
Yeah.
Also, just have fun with the code. It's perfectly fine if your goal is a career and you don't have a bunch of side projects, but the side projects definitely help. All the best developers I know have been people who are constantly tinkering on some little thing of their own.
Yeah. Okay. And what would you advise to someone who is stuck? What should they do? What would you advise? Stuck
Someone
in
who
general.
is stuck.
yeah, stuck on a problem, on code, don't know where to go, what to do.
Um, work on something else for a little bit. I know that we don't always have this opportunity, but just try to take your mind off of the problem. A lot of people, they take a shower and they do amazing thinking in the shower. Um, or you can just put the problem aside, work on something else for a bit, and a week later come back and retackle it with fresh eyes, and you'll probably get through it.
Right. And I guess the first choice when choosing or starting programming, uh, well, you should start focusing on something. Like you should early on find your path, what you want. Like at least the direction, back end or front end. Um, so, do you follow the same? Do you share the same opinion that you should focus on one language, one path, or try as many different things as a beginner?
Be excited to try new things, but at the same time, try to avoid sort of the hype culture that exists in programming. Like if you look at JavaScript libraries, for instance, there's a really cool new thing every week. And if you constantly switch to the latest cool thing or the latest language someone posts about on Reddit, like you're going to have a lot of surface level knowledge, and you're going to be missing a lot of sort of the in-depth design stuff that you can carry
Mm,
with you to any language or any library you use. So yeah, I'd say be comfortable trying new things, but not too fast. Like take it slow. Try to master things before you move on to the next one.
yeah, and would you be able to um, tell how to figure out to a fresh uh, person getting into programming what he likes more, back end or front end? Like you started yourself from HTML, as you said, yet you're very backend oriented. So how do you figure out which path do you want to take?
Um, I would say try to. You don't need to be an expert in all of it, but for instance, if you're doing making a website, learn both the front end and the back end part of it.
Hmm.
I think one of them will probably naturally pull you to it, um, and it won't be immediate, but eventually you'll start realizing, oh, I really like optimizing these SQL queries, or hey, this CSS, I'm really good at making sure things are centered.
Yes.
um, so you'll kind of naturally learn your passion, and before you figure that out, just try to understand the whole picture a little bit, and you'll eventually get there.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so what about you? What piece of advice has stuck onto you that you've figured out? Well, that someone gave you. Maybe you have it stuck in your head. Anything in particular?
Take notes. I guess that's the biggest advice that I've had. Make sure you're writing things down. You make sure you're writing code yourself, not just copy pasting solutions and things like that. I think that
Would
that
you say
has driven me pretty well.
even as a beginner who has no idea how to write code, the first step would be to write your own and not copy it, modify it, and then only then try to invent and write your own thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly start from small examples. When you're first starting out, you're going to find, the classic hello world and move on from there. But um, make sure the first time you see a for loop that you're experimenting with it yourself, that you're not just taking taking an example from somewhere and using it because it works. Don't always follow along the instructions perfectly. If you see something interesting, try to experiment with it a little bit and get some compile errors. Learn why you're getting those errors, that sort of thing.
Yeah, from learning from mistakes is the best kind of learning. I agree. Um, so taking notes, does that mean taking notes while you're learning, while you're in a meeting, while you're coding, maybe even?
Yeah, so definitely take notes in meetings.
Yeah.
Um, don't assume other people are taking notes too. Um, while you're coding, um, if you're going into a project that already exists, definitely try to take notes on general architecture, interesting things that you noticed in the code that
Hmm.
maybe aren't super obvious at times, that sort of thing. Um, yeah, just try to take notes. Writing things down really kind of solidifies a thought in my memory
Yeah.
much more than just seeing something and moving on and trusting that I'll remember it later.
Yeah. I 100% agree. Um, so one more question from Demi-chan. Where should I start when it comes to learning networking in C Sharp? All I see on the internet are uninformative tutorials that don't explain anything.
I suppose it depends on what type of networking. You can certainly do quite a lot of networking just with HTTP client, but if you want to learn, for instance, like sockets
Mm,
and things like that, start learning how to parse. So get a some format that is just bytes and find out how to translate that into actual .NET objects. Get really good at that, and the rest of networking all comes very easy. Um, you know, be comfortable using Stream, and Socket has a whole lot of things you can do on it. But if you learn just the basic connect, accept, send, receive, you will know 90% of what you work with every day.
awesome. Awesome advice. Um, do we have any more questions? A few more. Paulo asked, what kind of design patterns, if any, are you using in your .NET team? Or maybe I'm sure you're using some, but what would be the most common ones or most applicable?
Um, hmm. So I might not be the right person to ask this because I actually didn't learn a lot of the design patterns. I didn't. I'm self-taught, so I didn't go to school to learn this stuff.
Hmm?
And what I've noticed is that um, as you start to do real-world work and you kind of move out of college and you move out of college, you find out that a lot of the design patterns they are they're not strict rules. They're more like guidelines. Like
Yeah.
here's a good idea someone had at some point, and what you actually end up coding is kind of a mix of all of it and learning, you know, when a trade-off is worth it. That maybe you don't follow a design pattern perfectly. So I don't know there's anything that we follow strictly, but we certainly use elements from all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree to that. Patterns, just like principles and paradigms, are guidelines. Um, they are very good to solve certain problems, but we shouldn't try and apply them completely by the book because, I mean, it would be ridiculous that a generic solution for a generic problem written decades ago would work exactly as is for us in 2020.
Yeah, but I would say if you're learning to code, by all means, follow them strictly because you will probably write better code following them than
Mm-hmm.
not. But also, don't be afraid to experiment and see when it's good to not follow them because as you get further into your career, you'll start caring about them less and less.
Yeah, right. Um, okay. Um, One last question. Do you prefer laptop or desktop in programming?
Definitely a desktop. Um, Especially when you're compiling things and running benchmarks. The performance and thermal capacity of a desktop can be fantastic. Um, Benchmarking on a laptop can be very difficult because the CPU will throttle down halfway through a benchmark. Um, and Yeah, it's definitely not as portable, but I think it's a little better when you're doing programming.
All right. Thanks. Um, do you have any social media that you would like to share? GitHub, projects, Twitter, similar?
Yeah, my GitHub and Twitter handle is scalable Corey.
Could you type it in the events channel?
Sure. In the general chat.
Events, there is all the way down in social. Event. Socializing at the bottom event.
Got it. There we go.
Thanks. Um, so yeah, that's really it. That's all the questions I wanted to ask. Now I'll unmute all the people and
Awesome.
allow them to speak. So you can speak now, everyone, if you still have questions. Um, you should be able to unmute. Can anyone confirm that you can unmute yourself? Nope. Uh, uh, Speak. Could okay. I somehow need. You probably need to rejoin, but I can remove that myself manually. Okay, you can now
Seem
talk.
to work.
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions? Yay. No questions. It's good.
Awesome. It's been fun. Thanks for the good interview.
Yes. Thank you too for taking your time and uh, talking about the things that I and others wanted to know. It's been very useful, fun too. Um, so yeah, next week we're gonna do it again with um Star Walker. So it's gonna be a very different perspective. So yeah, go try. We'll try to continue this as long as I find people who are willing to talk.
Yeah, this will be fun, I think.
Yeah. So I'll stop.